somewhere in the high desert of eastern California, at an elevation where the wind is a constant presence and snow remains a possibility in nearly every month. There sits a town the state of California officially describes as existing in a state of arrested decay. Not restored, not preserved, arrested. As if the decay itself had been caught mid-action, interrupted in something it wasn't meant to be doing, and frozen there, still reaching. The town is called Bodie. Between 1877 and 1882, its population ranged from 7,000 to 10,000 people, depending on which census taker you believed. And the census takers in Bodie often didn't last long enough to finish their counts. In those 5 years, the Bodie morgue processed more bodies per capita than any other settlement in California. The town had 1 church and 65 saloons. It had a red light district that operated around the clock. It had a Chinatown, a Maiden Lane, a brewery, a slaughterhouse, and a bank vault robbed so many times that the lock was eventually welded shut rather than replaced. Its reputation, stretching from San Francisco to Sacramento to the mining camps of Nevada, was that of a place where a man could arrive on Monday and be in the ground by Friday, with no report ever filed. Some of that reputation was exaggeration. Mining towns always cultivated a mythology of violence, because violence attracted a certain kind of man. And those men spent money. But some of it, the parts not written in newspapers, the parts recorded only in coroners' logbooks and in private letters of men who left Bodie quickly and never returned, was worse than the reputation suggested. There were things that happened in Bodie that the official record buried, not because they were unimportant, but because they were inconvenient. Things that connected men of influence in ways they could not afford to have connected. What we know today about Bodie is largely what was permitted to survive. Before we continue with the story of Bodie and what it actually cost to build, to break, and to bury, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. And while you're there, drop a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. We read every single one. We want to know who's out there with us tonight. Now let us go back to the beginning. Not the beginning that appears in tourist brochures, but the real one. The one that started not with gold, but with a man named Waterman Bodie, a blizzard, and a decision that should never have been made. The eastern Sierra Nevada in the late 1850s was not a place that invited settlement. The mountains rise abruptly from the Great Basin, and the terrain between them, the high desert valleys, the alkali flats, the volcanic tablelands, has a quality of hostility that early settlers often described not as dangerous, but as indifferent. The land didn't want to kill you. It simply didn't care whether you lived or died. And in that indifference, it killed many. The elevation at which Bodie would eventually sit, 300 feet above sea level, in the volcanic highlands east of the main Sierra Nevada crest, meant that the seasons there were not the seasons men from the eastern states or Europe recognized. Winter arrived not in December but in October, sometimes September. It did not depart until May, sometimes June. Snow did not come gently. It came sideways, driven by winds that had crossed hundreds of miles of open desert before arriving at the highlands with nothing left to stop them. The temperature in January could fall to 30 below zero Fahrenheit, before accounting for the wind. There was no shelter in the landscape itself, no deep forests, no sheltering valleys. The terrain was high and flat and open, and whatever lived there did so in full exposure to whatever the sky decided to do. The Paiute people had lived in that region for centuries and understood its rhythms. Where water could be found in summer, where game moved in winter, how to read the sky when the temperature dropped 40 degrees in an afternoon. They called the volcanic highlands east of the Sierra by names that translated roughly to the place of difficult passage and where the wind has no mercy. These were not poetic designations. They were practical ones. The Paiute moved through this country with the knowledge of people who had learned over many generations which parts could sustain life and which could not, and on what schedule and at what cost. They knew the highland basin where Bodie would eventually stand was not a place to winter. They knew it because their ancestors had tried, and the ancestors had told their descendants what that trying had cost. The men who arrived in the 1850s looking for gold did not speak Paiute, and most of them would not have listened if they had. William Bodie, the man whose name would eventually, through misspelling and misremembering, become the name of one of California's most notorious towns, arrived in the Mono Lake region in the summer of 1859. He was a prospector from Poughkeepsie, New York, a man who had spent most of his adult life chasing something just over the next ridge. He had been in California since 1849, following the original rush, and by 1859 he was 41 years old. Trail, worn and running low on both capital and patience. He had tried the rivers of the Mother Lode, the gravel bars of the American River, the Feather River, the Trinity. He had worked for wages in the hydraulic operations of the Northern Sierra and saved enough to strike out on his own again, only to lose that savings in a claim that yielded nothing. He had started again. Men like Bodie were the majority of the California mining population by the late 1850s. Not the ones who had struck it rich in '49 and become legends, but the ones who had followed the legend and found only the diminishing returns of a rush already past its peak. They were patient in the way men become patient when their alternatives are worse. He had partners, as most prospectors did, men whose names the historical record treated with less care than it treated Bodie's. One was a man called Black Taylor, who may or may not have been born into slavery and freed before reaching California, depending on which account you trusted. Another was a French-Canadian whose name appears in some records as Doré, and in others simply as the Frenchman. Both men were experienced in the rough mechanics of high country prospecting, placer panning in summer streams, assessment of quartz outcroppings, calculation of whether a promising sign justified the cost and labor of following it deeper. In late July of 1859, Bodie, Taylor, and Doré discovered placer gold in a ravine in the highlands, about 80 miles north of Mono Lake. The amount was not spectacular. Enough to confirm the presence of a vein, not enough to make anyone immediately rich. But in the exhausted arithmetic of late-stage California prospecting, it was enough to matter. The color they found in the pan was consistent. The rock formation suggested something below the surface that surface samples couldn't fully reveal. In the language of the trade, it was a showing, a reason to look further. Bodie recorded the claim, sent word south, and began making plans. He did not survive to execute them. In November of 18, Bodie and a companion named Esk, a younger man recently arrived from Ohio, who had attached himself to the party of the summer and proven himself willing if not particularly skilled, set out from their winter camp to retrieve supplies from a settlement in the valley below. They had put off the journey longer than they should have, waiting for a break in the weather that came briefly and then closed again before they reached safety. A storm came in from the north faster than either man anticipated. Esk survived by finding shelter in a stand of pinyon pines and building a fire from deadfall, feeding it through the night while the wind brought the temperature down to levels that made breathing painful. Bodie did not. He was found the following spring, frozen, less than half a mile from camp. He had made it nearly far enough. The camp was visible from where they found him, a fact everyone who subsequently told the story noted, because it had the quality of things that are true and terrible, rather than simply terrible. He was buried near the discovery site in an unmarked grave. His partners misspelled his name in the claim documents, whether by accident or carelessness, and the place became Bodie rather than Bodie, a slight distortion that somehow felt appropriate for a town who would spend the next 20 years distorting everything it touched. For almost 2 decades after Bodie's death, the claims in the Highlands changed hands multiple times without yielding anything significant. Small operations came and went, men staked, dug, gave up, moved on. The land around the original discovery site remained largely unworked, its deeper veins untouched beneath a few feet of volcanic soil, while men who might have found it chose easier country. The winters drove most operators out. The cost of supplying an operation at that elevation on roads impassable for 5 months of the year made margins on low grade or impossible. The Standard Mine Company, incorporated in San Francisco in the early 1870s by men whose primary expertise was financial rather than geological, maintained a small crew on the property without serious expectation of a return. It was the kind of investment wealthy men made when they had money to lose and a theory about what the rock might contain. Then, in 1876, a mine shaft collapsed. The Standard Mine's operations had included, in the years before the collapse, a series of exploratory shafts driven into the hillside at various angles and depths. Following what the company's geological advisor, a man from San Francisco, who visited twice a year and spent the rest of his time in an office, believed were the most promising structural indicators. One of those shafts, the eastern one, had been driven deeper than the others, deeper than the budget had originally authorized, because the foreman on site, a practical man named Gideon Frey from Ohio, who had 30 years of mining experience and no interest in the financial theories of men in San Francisco offices, had a feeling. The feeling was based on the color of the rock, the angle of quartz intrusions, and the way the temperature dropped as you went deeper. Experienced miners used this as an indicator of particular geological conditions associated, in that part of the Sierra, with high-grade ore. Frey's feeling turned out to be correct. The collapse of the eastern shaft in the autumn of 1876, which killed 2 men, a fact noted in the company's records and not dwelled upon, exposed in the rubble a vein of gold, bearing quartz, that assayed at values that made the company's owners go pale when they read the report. Not pale with fear, but with the particular shock of sudden, almost incomprehensible wealth. The assay numbers were checked twice, because numbers like that were the kind of thing that happened in stories, not in the accounts of working mines in the California high desert. The numbers were confirmed. By the spring of 1877, the word was out, and the men began to arrive. In 1878, Bodie had a population of somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 people, growing by hundreds per month. The Standard Mine and the Bodie Mine were producing ore at rates that justified every superlative the San Francisco papers could manufacture. The Bodie Bank processed more gold dust in a single week that springing than some counties processed in a year. The town's commercial district on Main Street extended nearly half a mile, with wooden storefronts pressed so tightly together that a fire at one end would have consumed everything before a man could run to the other. They had 2 fires in 1878, neither was the last. The town itself had the quality of a place that had grown faster than its bones could support. Streets existed because men walked through the same mud often enough that the mud developed ruts, and the ruts became roads, and the roads attracted buildings on either side without plan or logic. Town water arrived from a spring on the hillside, through a pipe that froze solid every winter. So between November and March the town obtained its water from snow packed into barrels and melted near stoves. A process both laborious and ineffective, since the barrels were rarely clean and the snow rarely free of whatever the wind deposited in it during its crossing of the volcanic flats. Sanitation arrangements were charitably provisional. In summer, the smell from the alleys behind the commercial district carried as far as the residential areas on the hill, and men who had grown up in places with sewers wrote home describing Bodie in terms their families did not always believe. The violence in Bodie during its peak years was not merely anecdotal, it was structural. The town had more than 60 establishments selling alcohol, an opium trade, a gambling economy, and a floating population of men with no stake in the community's future, because they did not expect to remain long enough to have one. The justice system consisted of a sheriff whose jurisdiction was technically Mono County, but who was physically located 30 miles away in Bridgeport. A town marshal replaced 8 times in 4 years for reasons ranging from corruption to incompetence to death, and a justice of the peace who held court in a room above a saloon, whose rulings were occasionally enforced and occasionally not, depending on whether the defendant had friends better armed than the plaintiff's friends. To live in Bodie in 1878 was to exist in a condition of continuous low-level alarm. The sounds of the town at night, and the town had no real night, because saloons ran until dawn and mills ran around the clock, their stamps pounding or in a rhythm those who lived in Bodie long enough stopped hearing, included, with a regularity that ceased to be remarkable. Gunshots, sometimes distant, sometimes close, sometimes followed by shouting, by boots on wooden floors, by the particular quality of silence that followed sudden violence in a space full of men deciding whether to involve themselves. The newspapers of the era, both local and in San Francisco, covered Bodie's violence with something that looked, at a distance, like horror, but was actually closer to commercial enthusiasm. Stories of shootings sold papers, stories of robberies sold papers. The town developed a reputation, cultivated, exaggerated, but rooted in enough truth to maintain itself as the most dangerous settlement in California. A designation that attracted a particular kind of man and repelled the kind of family that might have stabilized it. The particular story of a man named Patrick Fahey, which circulated through the California press in the summer of 1879, sold a great many papers and then, with unusual speed, stopped being mentioned at all. Patrick Fahey was 34 years old in 1879. He had come to Bodie from Virginia City, Nevada, where he had worked as a shift supervisor in the Comstock mines long enough to save a sum of money he then lost in a speculation he ever after refused to discuss in detail. He arrived in Bodie in the spring of 1878 with nothing but his tools, his experience, and a reputation among mining men as someone who understood geology with uncommon precision. The kind of man who could look at a rock face and describe what it was doing 50 feet beyond where the candle reached. He was, by the accounts of the few people who knew him in Bodie and later spoke about him, a quiet and private man. He did not frequent saloons except occasionally when the cold was particular and the rooming house insufficiently warm. He did not gamble. He attended no church, which in 1878 Bodie meant he attended the same institution as the majority of its residents. He was Irish, born in County Clare, raised in Philadelphia, shaped by the particular combination of Catholic sensibility and American practicality that characterized the generation of Irish American men who came of age in the decade after the famine. He was a man who took notes. This was, in itself, unusual enough among mining men that his colleagues remarked on it. He carried a leather-bound notebook, small enough to fit in his coat pocket, thick enough to hold months of observations, and used it constantly, recording the dimensions of rock faces, the angle of ore intrusions, the temperature and air quality at different depths of the shaft. The discrepancies he noticed between what he observed and what the official maps of the mine's workings depicted. The discrepancies were, at first, what geologists would call normal, minor variations between an idealized map and the actual irregular reality of rock under the earth. But the discrepancy Fahey found in the late summer of 1879 was not the ordinary kind. He hired on at the Standard Mine, and within 6 months he was a shift foreman, a significant advancement for a man without local connections. His supervisors, particularly the mine superintendent, Calvin Pratt, who had come west from Pennsylvania with a degree in mining engineering from a school that no longer exists, and managed the Standard's operations with a combination of technical competence and political sophistication that kept San Francisco's investors satisfied and Bodie's miners from organizing, recognized Fahey's practical knowledge and used it. Fahey knew where the ore was. He had a gift for it that Pratt, for all his formal education, could not replicate. The problem was that Fahey also knew other things. In the early autumn of 1879, Fahey wrote a letter, partially survived because a portion was entered into a county proceeding that was itself only partially preserved, in which he described what he had discovered in the lower levels of the Standard Mine's eastern shaft. He did not describe it clearly, which may have been deliberate caution, or may simply reflect that he did not yet fully understand what he had found. But what he described, in language chosen with the deliberateness of someone who understood they might be read by hostile eyes, was evidence that ore samples from a particular section of the mine had been systematically underreported. Not by accident, not by ordinary record-keeping slippage, but systematically, deliberately, in a pattern that, if Fahey's interpretation was correct, had been running for at least 2 years and had diverted a significant, uncalculated sum from the mine's public shareholders to persons unknown. The letter was addressed to a lawyer in San Francisco named Emmett Corcoran, who represented a consortium of investors holding shares in the Standard Mine. Corcoran received it. We know this because he later said so in a deposition. But he did not immediately act on it, explaining the delay by saying he wanted to verify the claims before bringing them to his clients. Patrick Fahey did not give him time to verify anything. On the night of October 14, 1879, Fahey was found dead in the alley behind the Occidental Hotel on Main Street. The alley was one of the narrow service passages that ran behind commercial buildings, used during the day by delivery men and at night by men who preferred not to use the front entrance of establishments whose front entrances implied a kind of public commitment they were not prepared to make. It was dark. The town had no gas lighting in the alleys, and the light from saloon windows on Main Street did not reach around corners. The cold that night was the particular cold of an October in the eastern Sierra, drier, sharper, sitting in the lungs differently than the cold of lower elevations, smelling of nothing, which was its own kind of wrongness. The official finding was that he had been shot during a robbery. His wallet and watch were missing. The town marshal at the time, Rufus Strand, opened an inquiry, but it produced no arrests and was formally closed within 3 weeks. The San Francisco papers ran the story for 2 days, then nothing. What they did not run, what no paper ran at the time, although several journalists later claimed to have been aware, was the fact that Patrick Fahey had not been carrying his wallet that night. His landlady, Agnes Corrigan, who ran the rooming house on Fuller Street, where Fahey had boarded for 14 months, told the inquest that Fahey had left his wallet in his room. that evening because he had told her he was only walking to the assay office and back. She had seen him go, she noted, as landladies note things about the men in their care, that he seemed preoccupied. Not frightened, she said, but the way a man seems when he is carrying something in his mind too large to set down. He carried nothing but his notebook, the small leather-bound notebook he used for geological observations, which, unlike the wallet and watch, was never found. The notebook. That is the detail that keeps appearing in the edges of this story, mentioned and then abandoned. Corrigan told the inquest about it. The inquest noted her testimony and moved on. Corcoran, the San Francisco lawyer, mentioned it in his deposition and then clarified, when pressed, that he had never seen its contents and could not speak to its significance. A mine worker named Thomas Healy, who had been Fahey's closest associate at the Standard and had been present at the eastern shaft the day Fahey made his discovery, testified before the same inquest that he too had seen Fahey take notes in that notebook on the day in question. Healy left Bodie 3 months after the inquest, went to Oregon, and according to a letter he sent Corrigan, after that the record of Thomas Healy ends. The notebook was never found. The inquiry was closed. The Standard mine continued operating, and in the spring of 1880, Calvin Pratt, the mine superintendent, Fahey's superior, the man with the engineering degree, purchased in cash a substantial house in San Francisco's Nob Hill neighborhood. The purchase price, recorded in public property records, was a number that did not align easily with a superintendent's salary, even a generous one. No one asked him about it publicly. No one seems to have asked him about it at all. The years between 1880 and 1882 were Bodie's apex. The Standard mine alone produced millions in gold during those 2 years, and the town grew to what contemporaries called its fullest and most terrible flower. A phrase used by a Methodist minister named Elias Drummond, who arrived in Bodie in the summer of 1880 to establish a congregation and spent most of the next year writing letters home to his bishop that grew progressively more desperate in tone. Drummond's letters have survived in their entirety in the archives of the Methodist Episcopal Church. They constitute, inadvertently, one of the most vivid first-person accounts of Bodie at its peak. Not because Drummond was a particularly skilled observer, but because he was genuinely shocked by what he saw and had not yet learned to moderate his shock for an audience. He described the streets at night as a continuous corridor of noise and ruin, in which the light from 60 doorways makes a kind of counterfeit noon. And men pass through it in states of intoxication, so profound that they appear to be navigating not a street, but some internal landscape of which the rest of us can have no conception. He described the cemetery on the hill above town, Boot Hill, though he refused to use that name, as filling at a rate that troubled him not only morally but practically. There was, he wrote in October of 1880, beginning to be a problem of space. He was not wrong. The Bodie Cemetery records, which are more complete than most of the town's surviving documents, list 273 burials between 1877 and 1882. Of those, 61 were attributed to gunshot wounds, 49 ruled homicides, 12 classified as accidents. Another 37 were attributed to mining accidents, 18 to freezing deaths, resulting from exposure to extreme winter conditions, 23 to illness, pneumonia, and various symptoms traveling under the name of fever, without further specification. The remaining category, simply labeled cause undetermined, numbered 41. People buried in Bodie between 1877 and 1882 whose cause of death was listed as undetermined. In a town where the coroner was also the town dentist and the town's most active gambling parlor operator, and where the coroner's official seal appears on documents that sometimes contradict each other in their descriptions of the same event. Undetermined could mean many things. Among the 41 was a man named Dario Luchetti. Luchetti was Italian, born in the Piedmont region, arrived in California in 1875, spent 2 years in hydraulic mining operations in the northern Sierra before coming south to Bodie in 1877. He was a laborer, not a skilled miner, which meant he did the physical work of breaking and hauling rock, rather than the technical work of assessing and directing it. He worked for the Bodie mine, not the Standard, and his employment records there are among the more complete surviving documents from the period. The Bodie mine kept better books than its competitor, for reasons likely related to legal caution as much as administrative virtue. Luchetti appears in those records as a reliable, uncomplaining worker who received periodic wage increases and never filed a grievance. He also appears, and this is where his story becomes less ordinary, in the private account book of a man named Samuel Obergefell, a merchant who operated a dry goods store on King Street and maintained, in addition to his business ledger, a second, smaller notebook in which he recorded personal debts, favors, and what he called, in his ornate, mid-century German script, matters of weight. Obergefell's second notebook was discovered in 1923 in the back room of a building in Bridgeport, California, by a woman clearing out property belonging to her deceased uncle. She gave it to a local historian who transcribed portions before the original was lost. Those transcriptions are held today in the collection of the Eastern California Museum in Independence. In September of 1881, Obergefell's notebook records a conversation with Luchetti. The record is brief. Obergefell was not a man who wrote at length about things he found uncomfortable, but its contents are specific. Luchetti had told him something about the Bodie mine's lower tunnels, something Obergefell describes only as the matter concerning the Chinese workers and the passage they were made to use. The Bodie mine, like many California mining operations of the period, employed a significant number of Chinese laborers. The Chinese workers in Bodie occupied a separate neighborhood, Chinatown, on the town's southeastern edge, and within the mine, they were assigned to the most physically dangerous work tunnels with the worst air, the lowest ceilings, the most unstable walls. This was not unusual for the era, nor illegal under California law at the time, though several labor organizations had been arguing for years that it should be. What Luchetti had told Obergefell, apparently, was something more specific than the general conditions of Chinese labor, something about a particular passage and its use. Whatever that use was, it troubled Luchetti enough that he told Obergefell, and Obergefell enough that he wrote it down under matters of weight, and then evidently did nothing about it. The next entry in the notebook concerning Luchetti simply records his death. Dario Luchetti was found dead on the morning of March 3, 1882, at the bottom of a shaft in the Bodie mine's eastern section. The shaft was one he was not assigned to work. The foreman's report states he must have wandered into the area by accident in the pre-dawn darkness. The shift began before sunrise in winter and fallen. The depth of the shaft was sufficient to ensure the fall itself was the cause of death. The coroner's determination was accidental death, recorded as undetermined in the cemetery records, which may indicate clerical error or something else. The discrepancy was never investigated. Obergefell noted it in his private book, Luchetti is dead. The matter he described is now, I think, beyond my ability to pursue. I will say no more of it here. He never did. The decline of Bodie did not happen all at once. It happened in phases, each of which felt, to those living through it, like a temporary setback, rather than the beginning of an end. The ore grades at the Standard and Bodie mines began dropping in 1882, not precipitously, but gradually, The way a tide goes out so slowly, you don't notice it's gone until you're standing in mud. Mill runs producing. At $20 of gold per ton dropped to 15, then 12, then numbers that made accountants in San Francisco ask questions the men in Bodie did not want to answer. By 1883, the population had dropped by half. By 1885, by half again. The saloons began closing, not all at once, but one by one. The Chinese laborers left in organized groups for San Francisco and Sacramento. The red light district contracted to a single street, then a handful of houses operating quietly. The Bank of Bodie closed in 1884, taking with it whatever records it maintained about financial movements of the mine companies and their officers. Calvin Pratt, the Standard Mine superintendent, had already been gone for 2 years by then. He resigned in the fall of 1882, citing personal considerations, and returned to his Nob Hill house, living comfortably for the rest of his long life. In an 1891 interview with the San Francisco Chronicle, on the occasion of his appointment to the board of a new Nevada mining concern, he described his years in Bodie as formative and challenging in ways that built character. The interviewer asked about the town's violence. He said it had been exaggerated. Asked about the Standard Mine's production records. He said they had been exemplary. The interviewer did not ask about Patrick Fahey. The interview was published on a Sunday and, by all accounts, well received. Emmett Drummond, the Methodist minister, left Bodie in the spring of 1883 for a congregation in Stockton, then one in Sacramento. In his final years of active ministry, he gave several lectures on mining town morality, notable for what they omitted. He spoke at length about drinking, gambling, and violence in abstract terms, but never mentioned Patrick Fahey, never Dario Lucetti, never the specific content of conversations recorded in his private correspondence, which he appears to have burned before his death in 1909. Agnes Corrigan, Fahey's landlady, stayed in Bodie longer than most. She converted her rooming house into a boarding house, then, as the population shrank, into a private residence. Listed in the 1890 census as one of fewer than 300 people still resident in Bodie, she died there in 1897 in a town that had shrunk to a skeleton. A few dozen holdouts, a mine or two still producing fitfully. Upon her death, she left a small collection of personal effects and a letter sealed with wax, addressed to no one. The letter was found by a drifter named Cole Renner, hired to clear the property, who had arrived in Bodie looking for winter work and stayed 6 months. Renner could read, which placed him in a minority among men doing that kind of labor, and read the letter before deciding what to do with it. Ultimately, he gave it to a woman in Bridgeport named Ida Sargent, wife of the Mono County recorder, who had taken an interest in collecting documents from the declining settlements of the region. Sargent held the letter for many years, showing it to several people, without making its contents widely known. After her death, it passed to her daughter, and after the daughter's death, to a historical collection. But which collection is a matter of confusion, because the letter appears in 2 separate inventories from the early 20th century, and in neither inventory after 1931. The contents of the letter, as described by those who read it before it disappeared, were as follows. Agnes Corrigan wrote that, in the weeks before Patrick Fahey's death, he had told her something she had not repeated at the inquest, because she was afraid, and she was writing it down now because she was old, and there was no one left to be afraid of. Fahey had found, in the lower levels of the Standard Mine's eastern shaft, a secondary passage, unmarked, not appearing on any official map, that connected to a section designated on internal company documents as an ore processing auxiliary. He had followed this passage and discovered that the auxiliary was not an ore processing facility at all, but a storage space, a large, reinforced chamber containing equipment for the systematic segregation and diversion of high-grade ore before it reached the mill. In plain terms, a skimming operation, high-grade ore being pulled from the rock before weighing and recording, diverted through the secondary passage. Processed separately, its value recorded nowhere in official books. The gold it produced went somewhere. The Standard Mines shareholders never saw it. Fahey had found this, measured it, estimated its scale, recorded his findings in his notebook, written to Corcoran the lawyer, and 3 weeks later was shot in an alley, the notebook never found. Corrigan did not name the men she believed responsible. She said only that Fahey had told her the operation could not have been maintained without the knowledge and cooperation of several people whose names he had not given her because he did not want her in danger. She had lived the 17 years since his death with the weight of that knowledge and was tired of carrying it. The letter ended, "I do not know if this will reach anyone who will do something with it. I suspect it will not. Things like this have a way of becoming old news before they become known news. But I have written it. That is the only thing left that I could do." The fire of 1892 destroyed most of what remained of Bodie's commercial district. It started in a building on Green Street in the early morning hours of a July day, in conditions of low humidity and high wind that made it unstoppable once it reached adjacent structures. 63 buildings burned. The town's population was small enough that everyone who wanted to watch did so from a safe distance, and no one died. What burned included the office of the Bodie Free Press, which had accumulated a library of back issues, correspondence, and unpublished materials, all gone by morning. The editor, Frank Overton, told the Bridgeport Chronicle he had lost, among other things, a file of documents he had been intending to do something with, though he did not specify what they were. When asked, he said only they were things that had been sent to me over the years by people who wanted something done and then thought better of wanting it. He was 71. He died the following winter. Whatever he had been intending to do with those documents went with him. The fire of 1892 is documented. The fire of 1932, which destroyed a second substantial portion of the town, is also documented. That fire was determined to have started in a building housing equipment of the last remaining mining operation, the Rose Cliff Company, attempting to extract value from old tailings using a cyanide leaching process new for the era. Dangerous technology in the hands of undercapitalized men working in the wrong season. The Rose Cliff fire burned for 2 days, destroying several buildings that had survived the 1892 fire, including the old assay office and the remains of the Standard Mines administrative headquarters. A historian from Berkeley, Marcus Aldrich, who had studied Bodie since the mid-1920s and visited multiple times to photograph and catalog surviving structures, wrote in a letter to a colleague that the fire had destroyed several items he had previously identified as potentially significant, including, he mentioned with particularity suggesting careful thought, the contents of a locked room in the Standard building that I had been unable to gain access to, and that the owners had refused to allow me to examine. Aldrich's letter, dated 6 weeks after the 1932 fire, is held in the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley as part of his research materials. The locked room is not mentioned in any other document associated with the Bodie historic site. By the 1940s, Bodie had dwindled to fewer than 20 people. The last full-time residents left around 1942, driven out by wartime labor demands and the simple mathematics of a town with no economic reason to exist. The buildings remained. The wind kept moving through them. The winters kept doing what winters at 300 feet do, settling into the wood, working at the foundations, finding the cracks, California designated Bodie a state historic park in 1962, using the phrase, arrested decay, to describe the preservation philosophy. Buildings maintained in the condition they were found, allowed to continue their slow deterioration without restoration, stabilized against collapse, but not renewed. An unusual approach to preservation, acknowledging something is falling apart and deciding to let it keep falling apart, just more slowly. The Standard Mine's eastern shaft, where Patrick Fahey made his discovery in 1879, is not part of the state park's accessible area. Listed as structurally unsafe for visitation and fenced off, its closure, according to park rangers who have spoken on background, predates any formal structural assessment. They are not aware of any inspection having been conducted to determine the shaft's actual condition. The secondary passage Fahey described, the unmarked passage connecting to the chamber with skimming equipment, does not appear on any map of the mine's workings in the state park's possession. This could mean many things. Maps from 19th century mining operations are notoriously incomplete. Passages were dug and not recorded. Records were lost in fires. It could mean all of those things. The chamber Corrigan described would have required significant construction, leaving physical evidence. Stone and timber don't disappear the way paper does. But no one who has the authority to look has looked. Just when you think you understand what Bodie was. A boomtown, a cautionary tale. A place where greed and violence and desperation ran together in the way they always did in the mining West. The story reveals another layer. If this resonates with you, share this video with someone who appreciates dark history. Hit the like button to keep this channel going and subscribe so you never miss a story like this. What happened in those tunnels is only part of what we still need to uncover. Because the Standard Mine story did not end with Calvin Pratt's departure or Patrick Fahey's death. It had a coda, involving a man who came to Bodie in 1938, nearly 60 years after Fahey's murder, and left without publishing what he found, giving answers that were never quite answers. His name was Bernard Holt, a journalist from Sacramento. Not a famous one. Not the kind whose name appears in histories of the profession, but the kind who spent 30 years writing for regional papers and knew how to find a story and knew when a story was bigger than he was. He came to Bodie in the summer of 1938 as part of a project his paper commissioned on the ghost towns of the California interior, and spent 3 weeks there, longer than the assignment required, staying in a tent at the edge of the town site because buildings were already considered unsafe for habitation. What he did during those 3 weeks we know primarily from 2 sources: the article he published, thorough and accomplished, saying nothing remarkable, and a notebook found among his papers when he died in 1971. His daughter, in settling his estate, found the notebook and read it, and because she was a careful woman who had grown up watching her father choose his words, recognized it was different from his other notebooks. More careful, more deliberate, written as if he thought someone might eventually read it, who wasn't supposed to. Holt had found something, not the passage itself. The physical shaft had partially collapsed by 1938, and the section Fahey accessed was inaccessible. But a set of documents wedged into the wall of the Standard Mine's old administrative office, behind partially detached paneling. The documents, damaged by moisture and age, but legible, were internal company memoranda written in the 1880s, discussing what the writer, whose identity Holt says he could not definitively establish, but who was almost certainly the mine's superintendent based on the authority claimed, called the secondary accounting. This was exactly what Corrigan's letter had suggested. A parallel record of ore extraction and processing, maintained separately from official books, recording the movement of high-grade material from the eastern shaft through an unmarked passage to a separate processing facility. The memoranda were not confessional, they were administrative, discussing quantities, schedules, personnel arrangements. What the men operating the secondary facility were paid for their silence. What happened when the arrangement was threatened? They did not use Patrick Fahey's name. They used a construction Holt transcribed with directness, suggesting no doubt. The matter of the employee who had been conducting unauthorized surveys of the eastern section. And in a subsequent document, the resolution of the employee matter. The resolution. As if Fahey's death were a budget line, as if a man's murder were an administrative outcome. Holt's notebook records that he spent 2 days after finding the documents in a state of something between fear and calculation. He was aware, he wrote this explicitly, that the men who had authorized the resolution were dead. Pratt had died in 1914. The other names? The men who managed the secondary operation on the ground had died in the years between. There was no living criminal to expose, no case to make to a prosecutor. There was only the history, the fact of what happened, the mechanism by which a man was killed and his discovery buried. The 40 years during which the Standard Mining Company continued operating and its officers continued prospering, while shareholders defrauded never knew. Holt calculated whether publishing that history served a purpose proportionate to the risks. The men were dead, but they had families. The Standard Mine had been absorbed into other entities, absorbed into others still. The way mining concerns always move capital through successive corporate containers. There were people. He did not name them in the notebook, with a financial or reputational interest in the matter remaining buried. And there were people in positions of authority, again unnamed, he had reason to believe would prefer the story not be told. He published the Ghost Town article, well received, saying nothing about the documents. He took the documents when he left Bodie and kept them for 33 years until his death. His daughter found them with the notebook. Read them, put them back. She told one historian in a conversation in 1979 that she had decided to let her father's decision stand, because he had lived with it longer than I have, and he knew things I don't. She died in 1994. The documents and notebook were part of his estate, handled by an attorney whose records are not publicly accessible. Whether the documents survive, and in whose possession is not known. What is known, what the documented record, partial and fragmented, allows us to say with confidence, is this: Patrick Fahey found something in the Standard Mine's eastern shaft in 1879 that threatened powerful men. 3 weeks later he was dead. The notebook recording his findings was never recovered. The men responsible died wealthy and respected. The company continued operating for decades. Fires in 1892 and 1932 destroyed much of the administrative record. A journalist found evidence of the fraud in 1938 and chose not to publish it. The evidence passed out of public reach and has not been seen since. Beneath Bodie, in the eastern section of the Standard Mine, in a shaft never formally assessed for structural safety. The stated reason for its closure. There is a passage appearing on no official map. It is still there. The rock doesn't burn. Today Bodie receives approximately 200,000 visitors a year. They walk wooden boardwalks of a town that stopped in 1942 and has been stopping ever since, slowly, incrementally. The way things stop when no one decides to stop them, but no one decides to maintain them either. The Standard Mine headframe still stands on the hill above town, visible from the main road as you approach, rising against the eastern Sierra sky with the particular silhouette mining infrastructure has. Functional, angular, stripped of any attempt at beauty. The park's interpretive materials describe Bodie's history in terms of boom and bust, human ambition and natural forces. A town that rose quickly and fell quickly, leaving a lesson about the transience of wealth. They mention violence in measured terms, the high rates of death, the 65 saloons, the reputation that kept respectable families away. They mention several documented killings, the famous ones that made papers and became part of the town's mythology. They do not mention Patrick Fahey. They do not mention Dario Lucetti. They do not mention the 41 people buried in the Bodie cemetery under, 'cause undetermined. There is a docent program at the state park, staffed by volunteers who know Bodie's history with intimacy from years of study. Several have mentioned, in conversations with researchers and journalists over the decades, that requests to have the eastern shaft professionally assessed have been met with what one longtime volunteer described carefully as a lack of urgency that I find hard to attribute entirely to budget constraints. The state maintains Bodie in arrested decay. Apt in ways perhaps not fully intended. Decay arrested, caught in the act, stopped before completion, held in permanent incompleteness, where the ending always approaches but never arrives. The buildings lean, the wind works through the gaps. In winter, when tourists are gone, roads impassable. The town returns to the silence it had before anyone arrived looking for gold. The only sounds the wind makes and settling. Timber as cold contracts it. Structures remembering in whatever way structures can remember what they once contained. The standard mine headframe stands above all of it. 140 years through fires and winters and the slow departure of everything that once gave it reason to stand. Below it, the eastern shaft descends into the dark. The passage goes where it goes. The chamber at the end, if still there, holds what it holds. Some things, once buried, resist excavation not because they are unreachable, but because the people with the power to reach them have decided, generation by generation, that the cost of what they might find is greater than the cost of leaving it where it is. Patrick Fahey knew something. He tried to tell someone. He died for trying. That is not a ghost story. Ghosts are comfortable, things we dismiss in daylight. This is something else. The record, partial, damaged, interrupted at every critical juncture by fires, disappearances, and deliberate choices of men who understood exactly what they were doing when they chose silence. This is the shape of what happened when wealth was large enough, men ruthless enough, institutions compliant enough that a murder could be wrapped in ordinary paperwork of a mining town and left to yellow for a century and a half. Bodie did not refuse to stay dead. Bodie was never fully alive. Not in the sense of the full accounting, the complete record, the unredacted version of what happened in those shafts, in those back rooms, in that alley behind the Occidental Hotel on the night of October 14th, 1879. The town is still there. The shaft is still closed. The passage appears on no map, and somewhere in a collection, in an estate, in a box, in a room no one has opened since 1994, there are documents a man spent 33 years deciding not to publish, and a notebook in which he wrote everything he found and everything he feared. This mystery shows us something we would prefer not to know about the past, that mechanisms of concealment were not exceptional, but ordinary. Not the work of unusual evil, but of ordinary self-interest operating where no one with power had reason to object. What do you think really happened in that eastern shaft? Do you believe everything about Bodie has been told? Or is there a version of this story no one has been permitted to tell? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this and want more stories like it, stories where the reality is real, because the people were real and the choices they made were the choices people actually made. Subscribe. Hit the notification bell. and share this with someone who thinks they know American history. There are always rooms we haven't looked in yet. We'll see you in the next one.